Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Hethel Butt in for Ann Schindler. Today, whether it's chicken nuggets and French fries or mac and cheese, children have become pretty picky about their food. We're diving into the historical, cultural, and scientific drivers behind choosy eaters. Later in the program, how St. Johns County farmers are tackling growing challenges following the recent freeze. But first, American children have long enjoyed the privilege of kids' menus and meal alternatives to otherwise more adventurous adult foods. But it hasn't always been that way. Here to explain how we got here, I'm joined via video by Helen Zoe Veit, author of Picky: How American Children Became the Fussiest Eaters in History. She's also an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. Helen, thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, your work centers on the history of American food. How did you get into this field of study?
Well, I've been studying American food for my whole career. I wrote my first book about food in the early 20th century. I'm a historian, and I've just always been interested in the ways Americans eat, in part because we usually assume that the way we eat is normal and natural. And when you study history, one of the big things you find is that it's changed so much over time. So I love this intersection of biology and culture.
And what exactly qualifies a kid as a picky eater, and how has that definition evolved over the last century or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our sense of what pickiness means has really changed over time. Right now, there is an incredible focus on texture. When people talk about pickiness today, right now in the 2020s or in the 2010s, texture is one of the first things people talk about. People hardly talked about texture. Even in the late 20th century, they were much more likely to talk about taste and taste buds. In earlier decades, people said, well, if a child is picky, it's because they're not hungry enough. They don't have a good appetite. And then if we go back about 100 years to the 1920s or 1910s, nobody said that children were picky at all. Childhood pickiness as a mass phenomenon is a really new concept. And of course, that's completely mind-blowing and counterintuitive to most of us today, because many of us today assume that children are naturally biologically picky, that they're picky for evolutionary reasons, and that there's really not much we can do about it. The hopeful message of this research is that when we look in the past, or when we look around the world, we see children learning to eat almost everything their parents like, sometimes even more foods than their parents like, from the earliest ages. So there's a lot of hope in this book.
How is pickiness considered a privilege?
Well, today, I would say that pickiness is really democratized in America, which is to say that sometimes the poorest children, and there are a lot of children in our country who face food insecurity. This is one of the great tragedies of the modern United States, is that in the wealthiest country in the world, a really significant percentage of children, somewhere around 1 in 5, sometimes experience food insecurity. And yet those same children are often really picky. However, that is new. The idea that, poor children and underprivileged children could be picky. No one thought that in the past. As late as the 1960s in the United States, people said, well, of course, poor children aren't picky. They have to eat what they're given. That made sense to people at the time. That has a lot to do with the weirdness of our modern food system, the way that food subsidies work today, where junk food and highly processed food is artificially cheap because the government subsidizes corn and soy and things that make it cheaper to have these processed and fast foods.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges that parents face is processed foods. Is that an uphill battle?
One of the things that I like to say to parents is that we tend to think of children's food as a battle. We tend to think of it as a sort of combat situation. And you often hear these metaphors when people talk about children's eating. But, back in the past, people didn't talk about food as being a fight. In the 19th century, Americans assumed that children loved to eat. When they talked about childish eating, what it meant to be a childish eater was someone who ate indiscriminately, They were greedy, they were eager, they were curious. That was what childish eating meant today. The fact that even we have this idea that it has to be a standoff or a battle, and one of the parties is going to win, that's a very modern way to think about food. I just want to put that out there just because it's also really mind-blowing to us. Um, in terms of processed food, one of the many problems around children's food is that as it emerged in the 20th century as a distinct culinary category, it was most often pushed by marketers who were trying to sell, packaged food, usually highly processed food, which means that it had been molecularly manipulated in factories, that had been changed on a molecular level to be highly palatable, to be really sweet, really salty, melty, crunchy, to have these really easy to love flavors and textures. And the very fact that it was processed meant that it was going to be packaged. It had the advertising as part of the packaging, and these could be labeled kids' foods. They could have cartoon characters on them or other personas. They could be marketed with jingles and on the radio and on television. So from the beginning, as it emerged, children's food in this country really was, linked to highly processed food in this way. And of course, those flavors, the fact that it's so easy to like, changed people's ideas about how children could and should learn to like food. So children who from a really early age were being fed first, sweetened baby foods, these jarred purees in the 50s and 60s and 70s were highly sweetened and salted. And then children, in toddlerhood would transition to these prepackaged products and animal crackers and special chips and cereals that were highly sweet and highly salty. The idea that children could like some foods right away became part of our culture. And the idea that it can take children lots of repeated exposures to learn to like other foods dropped out of our culture.
So, when did nutrition science begin to play a role in what parents feed their children, and how is that today?
Well, modern nutrition science emerged in the early 20th century. So the 1900s, the 1910s, concepts like vitamins and calories first entered Americans' vocabularies. And so, 100 years ago, you had these middle-class parents who were hearing this new message like, oh, you have to feed your kids vegetables. You have to feed your kids milk. People hadn't thought about nutrition as an obligation before. Back in the 19th century, people had eaten lots of vegetables. Sometimes they'd eaten lots of milk and other foods, but those had just been family foods that everybody ate. This idea that there was like a certain ration of nutritious foods that children had to eat on a schedule, this was seen as a really modern way to approach child feeding. So middle-class parents started saying, okay, you have to eat your creamed spinach and the baked fish and this milky custard for your 5 o'clock dinner. And if you don't eat it, then that's a problem. That kind of oversight and supervision and the idea that there was a certain quantity kids had to eat, that made, for one thing, it made meals probably less pleasant for kids. They were like, the food was less delicious, probably. It tended to be less seasoned, more plain. That was kind of a trend of the era. And parents started worrying. They're like, oh my gosh, Junior didn't finish his creamed spinach. He's going to be iron deficient. What are we going to do? That kind of oversight, introduced these metrics into meals that were, probably not really great for anybody. And parents started talking about kids as being, my child's a reluctant eater. They wouldn't eat their spinach. Whereas in the 19th century, when kids had just been presented with lots of flavorful foods, and also when the foods had been more highly seasoned, there had been more condiments, and when children had come to their meals hungrier, back in the 19th century, that had been an environment that really encouraged kids to eat widely and to eat, with enthusiasm.
Is it hard for parents to differentiate now what is healthy? For example, if you have sugary cereals that are fortified with vitamins, is that a little bit deceiving for parents, or can they make healthy choices even if it's packaged food?
There's a whole lot of misinformation and I think misunderstanding about foods today, in part because of marketing and fortification. So, if you go to the grocery store and you see on a package, like this contains 100% of, the recommended daily allowance of, certain vitamins or minerals, that can be reassuring to parents, especially if they're otherwise worried about their children's pickiness. But the problem is that these very foods that have the labels on them tend to be highly processed foods, almost by definition. It's the foods with the packages that tend to be the ones that are made in factories. And so that one thing that we've learned from nutrition science is that even if you're getting, lots of synthetic vitamins and minerals that have been sprayed onto food or mixed into food through fortification, you're still not going to get an ideal diet. You just can't get all of the vitamins and the fiber and the phytochemicals that we need for ideal health and growth from foods like Wonder Bread and High C and a fortified breakfast cereal. These foods all have, vitamins and minerals added. So it can be really confusing for parents. And of course, parents are already stressed. They're stressed about what their children eat. This is one of the hallmarks of modern parenting, is worry about your children's food, because we have a sense, most parents have a sense that the way kids eat today isn't ideal. And if they think about it, they know this can't really be natural. Even while we're told, childhood pickiness is natural and unavoidable, they know, Lunchables and, Go-Gurt and, fruit snacks and, all these kind of modern children's products, this is not our natural diet. It's not like humans as we evolved over the last 300 as Homo sapiens have existed over the last 300,000 years, it's not like this was the food of children. These are all incredibly modern industrial factory products. That's not like all children always had these foods or needed to have these foods. And yet, we're told that there's no other way to do it.
I remember saying when I was first having kids, we were never going to make separate meals. They're going to eat whatever we make. And here we are, taking separate meal orders for everybody and giving them individualized meals. So it is something, I think, even if parents are well-intentioned, and even if they were raised differently, I remember we couldn't get up off the table if you didn't finish your meal, that it is different now. Are there other contributing factors?
Yes, I think one of the largest contributing factors is the culture today around what it means to be a good parent. Because we've largely accepted as a culture today that to be a good parent is to create alternative meals for children or to provide alternative foods. If a child doesn't seem like they want to eat something, today it seems cruel to a lot of people to not offer an alternative. That seems like bad parenting, even corporal punishment. And it could be corporal punishment if children really were incapable of learning to like the same foods as their parents. And of course, that's the foundation of all of this. Many of us have just completely lost confidence that children are capable of learning to like, so-called adult foods. But what we see in history, and this really is, really 300,000 years of human history, not just in the United States, of course, but all over the world, in every human culture we know about, is that when young children came to meals relatively hungry, they played outside a lot, they often did chores outside, they didn't snack much. That was the historical reality for most people. And when the food, the main meal was the only food on offer, there weren't alternatives. And for most people in history, that was just reality. It wasn't that, parents were refusing to offer them this other food. There just weren't other foods that were readily available. Even if people had plenty of food, the food was usually raw and uncooked and not particularly edible. So meals were the only food on offer. What we see, in every single human society that we know about is that from the youngest ages, from the time that kids were toddlers, they could just learn to like the foods of their parents. And I just want to emphasize that word, like. They could learn to actually enjoy these foods. It's not that they were being forced to, consume foods that they hated over and over and over. It's that they genuinely learned to like these foods. This is what, one of the clearest messages of the historical research, and what you see just so clearly when you look in the 19th century United States. Children loved to eat, and the food wasn't bland. It was really pungent food because Americans didn't have refrigerators. So in order to make food, edible, to preserve the food, Americans were constantly doing things like pickling and smoking and fermenting and salting and drying their food. So the food was really flavorful. There were many more plant and animal species in the 19th century than we eat today. And from the youngest ages, American kids learned to love these diverse foods. And, so today parents, they've been told, don't push your kid to eat. Like, don't ever insist they eat anything in particular. We've been told as parents, don't even talk about health, because if you talk about health, kids are gonna, kids hate healthy food, supposedly, we've been told. We've also been warned, you can mess your kid up. You can create dysfunctional relationships with food, or if you insist a child eat a certain quantity, then a child will never develop a sense of authentic fullness, and then they'll be prone to overeating. Or if you make dessert a reward, then they'll associate dessert with love, and then they'll become overweight or obese. All of these myths circulate today and make parents feel so torn. They don't know what to do. They're paralyzed. They really often feel this incredible tension around like wanting their kid to be happy and wanting them to be healthy. And it seems like you can't do both. But the message from the past is that for most of human history, when parents expected children to share their meals, children came to meals with a pleasant pre-meal hunger, and then they weren't offered alternatives. Children learned to genuinely enjoy the same foods as their parents, and almost no one developed dysfunctional relationships with food. These modern problems with large-scale overweight and obesity, with regular dysfunctional relationships with food, with eating disorders, these are all incredibly modern problems. These things only emerged really in the 20th century. So we really can have it both ways. You can have children who are happy, who are joyful, and who eat an incredible diversity of foods. And I know it sounds like science fiction, but it's historical reality. That again, this is why this book is so hopeful.
Because it really gives you that context. Thank you so much. If you're just joining us, we are talking to author and food historian Helen Zoe Veit about her new book exploring how American children have become the fussiest eaters in history. And if you are a picky eater or have questions or comments, you can join the conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937 or go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways you can connect with us. We want to go to Charles from the West Side. Good morning, Charles.
Hi, good morning. My question is, I get the part about the texture because I'm 68, but I was not a Gerber baby. My mom was a pediatric nurse, and what she did was used a blender and, prepared my infant meals that way. And so I always hated things that quivered on my spoon, and that's the thing that to adulthood, I still don't like Jell-O or pudding or anything like that. But my other question was, my best friend will not eat eggs in any form. He said ever since he was a little kid, he never ate eggs except unless it was in baked goods, and French toast was at the limit, but even to this day, he won't eat them in any fashion. What could cause a singular food abhorrence like that? I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Today, it's just incredibly common that people have, individual preferences. And, whether this is deeply biological, whether it's more psychological, I think, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on that. One thing I can say, which is really mind-bending for us today, is that there are some cultures on Earth where people don't really have clearly articulated food preferences. There's a relatively limited set of foods that the culture eats, and everybody in the culture learns to like those foods. There have been some interesting studies done on the power of essentially exposure therapy, where someone who doesn't like a certain food, whether it's the taste or the texture or an association they have with it, but with repeated multiple positive exposures, people can learn to like, in many of these studies, even foods that they thought they could never do. And I know that sounds That sounds really hard to us because we think of personal preferences as just an innate part of who we are in many cases. A lot of Americans today, for example, they're like, well, I hate liver. I could never learn to like liver. Or there are people who don't like cilantro. And in the case of cilantro, it's interesting because there's a biological explanation for that. Some people have genes that allow them to actually detect these soapy aldehydes in cilantro that other people can't. But the fascinating thing is that when we see people grow up in cultures where, for example, liver is just a normal part of the diet, like a lot of France, liver, especially in the 20th century, was a really normal part of people's diets. There are lots of places in the world today where cilantro is ubiquitous in cuisines. And you just don't see in those cultures large contingent of liver haters or cilantro haters. So in other words, there might be biological reasons for some of our food preferences, but one of the lessons from history and anthropology is that culture can really overwhelm genetics in most cases. And even people today who are like cilantro haters because they have these detectors that let them taste these aldehydes, when they want to change and they have multiple repeated exposures to cilantro, they report learning to like cilantro too. Americans in the past, in the 19th century, often had personal preferences. They often had things they didn't like, one or two foods they didn't love, but nobody thought about that as related to age. So someone might hate turnips, for example, but they just thought, well, I'm someone who doesn't like turnips. It wasn't about children as a group having special aversions.
Does the same apply to spicy foods?
Yeah, well, spicy foods is one of those things that Americans, even if they're kind of open-minded about what children can eat, a lot of us today are like, well, children, of course, couldn't like spicy foods. But actually, if you go around the world, you see that in cultures where children are fed spicy foods from a really young age, children are fully capable of learning to enjoy even really, really spicy foods. So if you are someone who doesn't like spicy foods, if you have a lot of exposure to it, the evidence strongly suggests you could probably get used to it and perhaps learn to enjoy it.
Let's go to another caller, John in Riverside. Good morning, John.
Good morning. I'm currently reading this book. I have to say it's an absolute delight. To be honest, I really didn't expect too much from it when I bought the book. I'd read some very heavy things recently, and I wanted something lighter. I've been amazed. First of all, when you study history, you always get the battles and the big personalities. It's hard to find histories that actually talk about how the common people lived. This book is explaining all sorts of things that I knew about, like the 19th century. For example, I'd heard about the very restrictive diets for children where they wouldn't feed them fresh fruit and very bland foods. This book connects that to the high child mortality rate. It's absolutely heartbreaking when you think of these people desperately trying to find some way to keep their children from dying on them. But the other thing about it is it is amazing how the variety of foods that we ate. When you see the list of meats that they ate, these are things that they hunted, you realize that we are really eating a very narrow diet these days. So this book is an absolute delight. I can't recommend it enough.
Did you want to add anything to that in terms
of
how our
so
diet?
It's so nice of you, John, to say that. I really appreciate it. Writing the book was so much fun. It was so interesting just to read about how different food used to be in the United States. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think a lot of Americans today, we hear about like people in different cultures, in different countries eating differently. But man, you don't have to go back very far in our own country to see Americans having these totally different ideas about food. And just to sort of expand a little bit on what John was talking about with child mortality, I really see the origin of some of our ideas today that children should eat differently. It really goes back to the 19th century because child mortality rates were so high, and they were high because of diseases. Like epidemic diseases was the number one cause. There were no vaccines. People didn't know about germs. This was before germ theory had solidified, and they were searching for a reason why are children so uniquely vulnerable to disease and death? And some reformers said, well, it must be because children eat so widely. Children are constantly eating, meat and pickles and all these fermented, strong tasting, spicy foods. And it must be that these are too stimulating for their little bodies. So they started encouraging people to feed their kids bland food, unseasoned food. And from this, we really see, the modern version of children's food as its own separate genre emerge in the 20th century.
In the book, you talk about the role of texture and color and how famous civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson, who was born right here in Jacksonville, loved what he described as the almost vicious consistency of gumbo as a young boy. Why was that considered unusual?
Well, at the time, it wasn't. The idea that a child would enjoy something that was viscous, which means like thick and actually slimy. Like that's the actual definition. It means a slimy consistency, which we know if we've had gumbo, made with okra or these other filet, these kind of slimy ingredients. The idea that slimy is bad is, of course, a cultural idea. And yet, if you think about it, one of the interesting things that I found about texture is that we tend to be selective when we talk about what textures kids are capable of liking. If we're talking about things being kind of gummy and slippery, if it's about plants, if it's about vegetables, we're like, oh, a child today could never like okra or eggplant. But if we're talking about like buttered noodles, that's a pretty slippery food, almost slimy sometimes. But we don't think of that in the category of a food children couldn't like. It's mainly about vegetables and fruit when we start to think that children have these special textural needs.
We received an email from Marty, and it says, our daughter is 7 now, and she's extremely sensitive to food, especially meat. She doesn't just avoid it. She can't even handle the smell, and she only eats a handful of foods. I grew up in a eat what's cooked or you don't get household. But as a parent now, I try to give her some flexibility while still making sure she's getting nutrients. Do you have any advice for her?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, you are not alone. Like that is, an incredibly normal dilemma to be in as a parent in the 2020s and in the 21st century. That's just like a normal way to be. If you are interested in expanding your daughter's taste, and the things that she takes pleasure in, I give a lot of tips in the book to parents in general. I have 3 children, and from birth, I raised them with very, very different methods than Americans today, because I was spending my work days with 19th century people and just hearing about this totally different parallel universe where people did things differently. So I'll just describe what I did. And it may or may not speak to anybody listening as a parent, and it may not feel comfortable to everybody, but what I did, I tried to make sure my children had pleasant pre-meal hunger. In other words, I didn't let them snack too much. I did let them snack. I love snacks myself. I am pro snack. But if I knew we were going to eat in an hour and one of my children said, I'm hungry, I'd say, oh, that's great. Hold on, we're going to eat in an hour. You're going to love dinner. It's going to help you enjoy dinner. Then during dinner, we are told as parents today, don't urge your children to eat. That's annoying. I absolutely urged my children to eat. I would, with joy and enthusiasm and humor, I would say exactly why I loved the foods that we were eating. I would describe why I loved them, and I would encourage them to eat over and over. My children were all really neophobic, which means they were scared of new foods. They often did not want to eat what we were eating. They would, clamp their jaws and twist their faces away. But with love and humor, I would encourage them to eat over and over and over and over again in the same meal. And many, many times I could get them to be eating something, accepting it, liking something by the end of the meal that they had rejected multiple times at the beginning. Again, they're hungry. There are no alternatives. And then at the end of the meal, if a child really just would not eat something, and this is the hardest thing I'm going to say, this is the hardest thing for parents today to hear, but this is what I did based on the historical models I had. I would say, you don't have to eat. That's okay. But this is our dinner. And if you haven't had dinner, you can't have dessert. You can't have a snack. So you go and play. And if you change your mind, I'm going to save your dinner in the refrigerator. And, let me know if you get hungry. I'll heat it up in the microwave. And if you have 2 more bites, we'll say that that's dinner, and then you can have a snack. And for me and my kids, this worked every single time. After 45 minutes or an hour, the child just always came back and said, I'm hungry. And I'd say, oh, that's great. Let me heat up your food. Here you go, 2 more bites. And it just always worked for us. And I realized, like, my children are not all children, but this was modeled on what, our species has done since its existence. One thing to keep in mind is that mass pickiness is really, really new. And childhood omnivorousness, children eating everything, has been the norm for literally hundreds of thousands of years. Just knowing that gave me so much confidence. And I really came to think that parents having bedrock confidence that it was possible is probably the most important factor of all.
I remember hearing that sometimes you have to introduce a food up to 7 times to a child for them to really acquire a taste for it. Is there any advice you have for parents who have older kids? Is it too late to do this, or can you course correct?
Yeah. So it's kind of 2 different things. First is what you said, that idea that you should introduce a food many times. I totally agree with that part. But the idea that there's a limit, like after 7 times or 10 times or 15 times, you hear different numbers of the same idea, then they really dislike it. You can throw that out the window, because no human culture before ever pinned a number on food rejections or said there's a certain ceiling after which you should stop trying. People, because those were the foods of their culture and those were the foods that were available, people would keep offering it to kids dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And even, there have been some recent efforts to try to have basically therapeutic approaches to helping really picky kids learn to eat. And they're finding that some kids, especially kids who might have sensory issues or other neurodivergent issues, they might take dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of times, but they too can eventually learn to like these foods. But the ceiling is just, there is no ceiling. You can just keep trying. That's on the one hand. And then what was the second thing you asked? I'm so sorry. I lost the thread with all that enthusiasm. I just was going
to say, is it ever too late to kind of course correct if your child is already a picky eater at an older age?
That's a great question. And actually an extremely important one, because I imagine many parents today have children who are picky. I raised my children from birth to eat, to eat in this way. And it really, I had these, wonderful personal results that were very confidence enhancing. However, I also live in a neighborhood that's filled with kids. My 3 children have lots of friends. We have kids going in and out of our house all the time. And I can say that over and over and over again, we would have kids come to our house for a meal, for a play date. And I can't count the number of times a child would leave our house having learned to like a new food that their parents thought they could never like. I mean, I literally have friends who are like, my child eats 12 foods and 11 of them are beige. But the 12th food is those garlicky green beans that he ate at your house that one day. I don't know how you got him to eat them. I mean, really, I had this same version of this story again and again, because, we were enthusiastic eaters. We had the confidence. My own children were around modeling, children loving this kind of food. I actually have enormous faith that even older children can also learn to eat broadly if parents, create that family culture where the family meal is the only meal that's available, if they encourage their kid to eat with love. And also, you can reward your children for eating. This idea that it's psychologically harmful to reward kids, that was not based on any evidence. Really, almost none of the psychological advice we've gotten about children's food was based on rigorous comparative evidence. It really wasn't. This is one of the chapters of my book was digging into this. You can reward kids for eat, whether it's with, enthusiasm or gold stars or a special chart. My kids had a spicy food club where when they would try a new spicy food, we'd write it out and they'd get to put how many flames they thought it was. There are all sorts of fun things you can do to make, expanding a child's palate something that's fun for them too.
Well, that's fascinating information. Helen Zoe Veit is a food historian and author of a new book called Picky: How American Children Became the Fussiest Eaters in History. Helen, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Some great tips.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. Up next, St. Johns County is home to hundreds of farms. We'll tell you how you can visit 5 of them after the break. Welcome back. It's peak growing season in St. Johns County, and local cultivators are opening their gates for the public to explore. Here to tell us more about it is Prissy Fletcher, agricultural liaison and grants and policy analyst for the St. Johns County Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Prissy, you have a really interesting job. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what your role is in the community, and why is there a need for this?
Absolutely. So I am a Florida native. I grew up on a tree farm in Suwannee County, and I was very inspired by my upbringing. My family really emphasized that farmers were great stewards of the land and that it was important to take care of it. And so I ended up going to the University of Florida to study soil and water sciences because I wanted to do whatever would get my hands dirty. And I wanted a career that would guarantee that I was outdoors. So that seemed like a really good fit. And so I received my bachelor's, my master's in those degrees. I worked for the Cooperative Extension Service for 11 years. And then the county decided to create a new position that you just described. It's very lengthy. Thank you for explaining it for us. So it's a new position that was created because the county heard the requests of farmers coming to commissioner meetings, calling the county to voice their concerns. And Joy Andrews, our county administrator, and the county commissioners decided that they needed someone who represented the county to be that connection, to make sure that that communication continued and that we were hearing directly from them. And so it was important for me to create an advisory committee because even though I grew up on a farm, I don't currently farm. I don't work on one. My livelihood is not dependent upon that. So, well, I mean, we all do need to eat. We're all dependent upon farmers, but I personally do not own or manage a farm. So I felt it was very important that we create a committee where it was exclusively people who farm every day and live it and understand it and can truly explain to us what they're going through and what they need or don't need.
Why do you love your job?
I love my job because I love my community. I love my coworkers. I have the best team imaginable to work with. I have a great support system, and it just brings me joy to be able to help others, and especially the farming community, since that's what I came from. That's what I'm passionate about. And I'm a foodie, so.
Well, St. John's has a rich agricultural history, thanks in part to Henry Flagler and Thomas Hastings. In fact, Hastings is known as the potato capital of Florida. And currently, you are working on the Tour de Farm. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning our history. It's something that we're really proud of. When Thomas Hastings was asked by his cousin Henry Flagler to come and help produce food for his patrons, for his guests at the hotel, and it's grown into this, as you said, we are the potato capital. We are the hub for the winter production of potatoes in our country, which is really, really cool and unique. And one really fun activity that existed prior to the pandemic was the Slow Food First Coast Tour de Farm. So that's a nonprofit organization that was established in 2007. And the whole purpose was to connect the community with where their food comes from. So when you get a snail of approval, we're saying that your business supports food that is staying local, that's not traveling a long distance. So it's fresher, it's more accessible, less carbon footprints because of that travel, it being close. So what we were really excited to do, this group has been based, doing their events based in the Jacksonville area. And since it was founded in St. Augustine, they wanted to come back. And so I was really excited to ask the farming community if this is something that they wanted to participate in. And the feedback was overwhelmingly positive to bring awareness to the farms in St. Johns County, because we are known for our beaches and our tourism, and agriculture is a part of that too. So this is an opportunity for the public to come and meet the farming families. Their gates will be open. You can tour the fields for yourself. There'll be activities, other nonprofit groups at each location, and local food vendors preparing samples with ingredients that were locally sourced and in season.
We want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that the farmers are facing. A recent cold snap caused an estimated $3 billion in agricultural losses for the entire state, and Florida crops have definitely been falling victim to disease and development and disaster. So how are farmers dealing with those challenges?
One day at a time. But that's, I mean, you nailed it with that list. And the freezes this winter were absolutely intense. The billions of dollars of losses locally. We were impacted with the plantings and how anything young and tender really took a hit. So, and even down in Central Florida, I know the blueberry industry really took a beating, not just with the flowers and berries, but just the plants themselves were snapped, were uprooted. So it was pretty devastating, but we're surviving and we're going to get through it.
What about the citrus farmers?
Yes, so citrus farmers dealing with citrus greening is still a horrible bacterial disease that is spread by a psyllid. So they are still hanging on, though. There's still hope for the citrus industry with research and continuing to evaluate cultivars that are tolerant to the disease. So there's still hope, but it's a big factor of why the price of orange juice is so expensive. There's just not as many trees anymore. I believe the last statistic I read was 94% of our groves were impacted, lost because of this. So it's really tremendous and heartbreaking to watch, because that bacteria just, it clogs up the vessels, the phloem of the tree, so water and nutrients can't move. So it just slowly dies as it can't feed and support itself.
Well, I'm sure they're very happy that you're shining a spotlight on what they do. And this event, the Tour Day Farm in St. Johns County, is this Sunday, April 12th from 11 to 3 p.m. The touring farms are across Northwest St. Johns County, and we have a link for more info and tickets on our website. Prissy Fletcher, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, a new book explores how to find your purpose through asking the hard questions. We'll be right back.
Join film at WJCT Studios for Breaking Bad star Bryan Cranston in Arthur Miller's powerful American classic, All My Sons. Filmed by National Theatre Live, All My Sons tells the story of Joe Keller, a successful businessman whose wartime decisions return to haunt his family. The Keller household is forced to confront difficult questions about responsibility, loyalty, and the true cost of the American dream. April 23rd at WJCT Studios. Doors open at 6:30 p.m. Film starts at 7. Tickets at wjct.org/film.
I
I'm Robin Young. The Supreme Court hears arguments as it considers the Trump administration's push to end birthright citizenship, a key piece of the president's second-term immigration agenda. Experts say the 14th Amendment already confers citizenship to babies born in the U.S. Will the court's conservative majority agree? Next time, Here and Now.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
For decades now, the Austrian capital, Vienna, has strived for gender equality in urban development planning.
We have to be aware that different people have different needs, and to guarantee their safety, to guarantee their good education, to their economic development.
But many of those initiatives are facing backlash from the political right. That's next time on The World.
This afternoon at 3, here on WJCT News 89.9.
President Trump issued an executive order on his first day back in office, seeking to end birthright citizenship for the children of some immigrants. Every court that has considered the order so far has blocked it. Now, the Supreme Court will weigh in. I'm Washington correspondent Miles Parks. Join us for live special coverage and analysis from NPR News of the Supreme Court oral arguments over birthright citizenship.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. What is my purpose? It's a question everyone may think about at some point in their lives, but it's also the topic of a new workbook written by a local nonprofit leader. Here to talk about it is Kristen Keene, the founder and CEO of Rethreaded, a group that supports survivors of human trafficking. Kristen, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me.
What inspired you to explore the purpose with this new workbook?
A lot of different things. The first thing was I went on a sabbatical about 4 years ago, which means I went on a sabbatical. So I went as far east as Maine and far west as Montana, no work, no email. And I realized I was terrified to go on it, right? Because I didn't know who I was. What was I going to find when I was just by myself in the woods alone?
It was your eat, love, and pray.
It was my eat, love, and pray. Yeah. So when I came back, then I started to ask these questions, right? I had this amazing sabbatical, and I've been working with women coming out of severe complex trauma my whole career and watch them navigate healing and come out on the other side and live these beautiful lives. And I was like, really, how? It was like the perfect combination, right? How are women doing this? And we started to explore and look at different elements of what allowed women to heal and reach their potential. And there was 5 elements, including purpose. And we started to do a deep dive into purpose, which led to a workbook, which led to it transforming my life. So now I hope it can help other people.
Why do people need a workbook to really go and explore this within themselves? How is it helpful?
So the helpful is a guide about, like, first of all, what is purpose? You have to define it for yourselves. There's lots of different ideas about what is purpose, what purpose isn't. And then it takes time, because at the end of the workbook, I want you to have words to your purpose. So my purpose is to envision and activate the potential inside people. And that was after months and months of piecing it together and thinking this through and looking at my past. And then what stops you from living your purpose, and how do you really live it out in the world? So it's a process. It's on the workbook's on purpose
And
to get you to go through the process.
And you were talking about the 5 common powers. You mentioned purpose. The other ones are vision, openness, time, and community.
Yes.
Are any of those more important than the other? And how is there an order in which you kind of go through that?
This is what I love. We call it the Rethreaded process. And it's 5 powers. And it's more like a sphere. You know those spheres that go in and out, and when you throw it in the air, it expands? That's kind of how we think of the Rethreaded process. And if you pull on one power, it automatically starts to pull the other powers out. So there's no 5-step program. There's no, you follow this and this happens. It is an activation of these powers in your life. And you'll start to notice changes in other areas. Like when you start to live on purpose, it affects your time, right? Time is your resource in this life to reach your potential, and we all run out of it. But if you're living through your purpose on purpose, it transforms your time. It leads you to have a bigger vision in your life. So it's like all connected. So you start pulling on one and you start to grow.
Who is your audience, and do you find, for example, women in midlife are more driven to re-exploring what their purpose is?
Well, this has been the fascinating part, is that it's becoming universal. Like, I just spoke at a conference for home inspectors in Orlando under IEB coaching, and these mostly men were like so receptive, and a lot of people brought the workbook for their children, like in their 1920s, early 20s, right? Because they're kind of searching for what their purpose is. And the beautiful thing about purpose is that it doesn't change. It's inside you, right? And it gives you an internal locus of control, which is why this workbook can be good for any age, any gender, anyone who's asking those deep questions. I wish I would have known this earlier in my life, honestly.
And now you're spreading that knowledge to other people.
Yeah,
now,
spreading that knowledge.
In a couple weeks, you're hosting the first ever Rethreaded Process conference, Purpose Edition event. And tell us what inspired you for this event very quickly.
So this one is geared towards women. It comes out of our Women Empowering Women Network series. And this is a longer time period from 9 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon where you get to take time for yourself. You'll get a workbook when you pay for the conference. You get the workbook. And it is time for you to take the time to explore those deep questions, because we rarely do that. And one of the biggest reasons is time. So this is like a gift for yourself and for those around you.
Well, the Rethreaded Process Conference Purpose Edition is Saturday, April 18th at 9 a.m. at the group's main location at 515 East 9th Street. And we have a link to tickets and more information on our website. Kristen Keene, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And that's our program. Thank you for listening. And thanks to all who called and emailed today. We encourage your feedback and suggestions, and you can submit either at firstcoastconnect.org. You can also find all of our past and current shows. And while you're there, you can sign up for the FCC newsletter, which gives you a sneak peek at upcoming guests and a chance to submit your questions in advance. Join us tomorrow when we discuss seasonal allergies and hear from an allergist about why your symptoms may be more severe this season. I'm Hethel Butt, and you've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Accidents can happen when you least expect it. For decades, our attorneys have dug out the facts to help juries decide who's at fault.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
President Trump ran and won on a zero-tolerance immigration policy. Now many Americans say he's gone too far. From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A.